Okay. Yes, Robert, we are rolling live here, continuing our coverage of the T3 conference in Dallas, Texas. Robert, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And I should mention, of course, you are the founder and CEO of Levitt Capital Management.
Located in Nice, France.
Nice, France. Très bon. That's all I got.
Okay.
All right, so we were talking a little bit off camera, and I was really looking forward to this because we were at Nice for the first time this past summer.
Oh, super.
Purely coincidentally, the Tour de France was going on. We
Okay.
had no idea. We just booked an Airbnb. We got off the camera, and we're like, why is it so crowded here? They're like, the Tour de France. And it was just a beautiful city. Really enjoyed it. So we're not here to talk about Nice necessarily, but it ties in with what you do. So your firm is very fascinating. And let me just turn it over to you and tell us about what it is that you do in Nice and why it's so unique.
Well, it's the ultimate niche firm. I mean, what we're focused on is U.S. citizens who are fiscal residents in Europe. That means they live in Europe. They pay taxes in Europe. But because they're U.S. citizens, they also pay taxes in the United States. So it's a very complicated, sophisticated set of problems they have, which is very different than a normal person, a French national, or an American who lives in the United States. So they can't, for example, invest in a U.S. ETF. They can't invest in a U.S. mutual fund because those are regulated in Europe, and they're not allowed for European investors to invest in those products in the United States. Conversely,
Let me pause there for just a moment.
sure.
So I didn't realize that. So you cannot, if you are and these are not necessarily French citizens, these are U.S. expats that are residents, or are they dual citizens?
Well, they don't have, it doesn't matter because only in the United States does your citizenship mean something for taxes. Everywhere else, it's where you're a resident.
Okay.
So since you're a resident in France, you pay taxes in France just like a French taxpayer. But because you're a U.S. citizen, you also pay taxes in the U.S. just like a U.S. taxpayer. And there's a treaty between the two countries that explain where you pay taxes, one country or the other. And it's different tax treaty for Italy and Germany and Spain and Portugal and Denmark. And so each country, the way we have to deal with a U.S. citizen that's a fiscal resident there is very different.
Yeah.
There's no one size fits all.
But just to focus on the ETF for just a moment, so ETFs, trade freely here. So if I'm a U.S. citizen living in Paris or Nice or Saint-Tropez or wherever, I cannot buy a U.S. ETF?
No, you can't buy a U.S. ETF. And the reason is because European regulation says there needs to be a document, a 3-page document known as a KID. It tells us what the investment is, what the expected return is, and what the expected risk is. Conversely, in the U.S., you have this huge prospectus of legalese. So the European method I think makes a lot more sense, except that the SEC does not allow an investment firm to project a future return, and it's required by the European regulators. So unless you create a clone version of your product for Europe, there is nothing you can do. But even if you have a clone product, a U.S. citizen can't invest in it because the U.S. citizen is covered by rules of the IRS, which looks at those European products as tax dodges. And therefore, they won't allow you to invest in the S&P 500 index fund in Europe either. So you are prohibited from investing in the U.S. in funds and in ETFs, and you're prohibited in investing in Europe in funds and ETFs.
Wow, this is something I would not have thought. This is really interesting to me. So if I were to be a U.S. citizen living in wherever, France or whatever other country, can I still maintain my brokerage account in the U.S.?
You cannot.
Can't.
Because
Robert's getting very frustrated with me. It was like, Chuck, you just can't do it.
Not in 100% of cases, okay? But there are a few select firms that have decided to become licensed in Europe. Or Fidelity, for example. They are not licensed in Europe, so they cannot take a resident of Europe, even if it's a U.S. citizen. Same thing for Vanguard, for example. They can't take a European resident because they're not licensed there. So it's just like if an advisor like my firm tried to take clients in the United States, we would have to become SEC registered.
Right.
But a large firm like Fidelity or Vanguard, they have no interest in being regulated now by a European regulator over all of their affairs worldwide. So they've opted out. So there are very few firms. There are a few that really are focused on this market, but very few. And so when an American, and lots of Americans now are looking for the option of moving overseas and moving to Europe,
Sure.
they're looking for, how do I invest? How can I do what I what I want to, but in a way that's in conformity with the law and the tax rules.
Right. Well, I tell you what, I'm just having such a hard time accepting that, but I take you for it because, just because I'm living somewhere else, I can't buy my SPY or IVV. That's crazy.
So
I'm surprised to hear this.
The whole game changed in 2014, really, because the U.S. passed a law called FATCA. And FATCA required all foreign financial institutions to report to the IRS on any U.S. citizen. So at first, it took a few years for FATCA to filter through, and then the European banks, for example, they didn't want U.S. citizens, so they wouldn't even open accounts for U.S. citizens, even bank accounts for U.S. citizens.
Cool.
But eventually, they developed the compliance rules. But what it did was it forced Americans now to actually report on their taxes all their European investments, and it turned out that a lot of those European investments were not allowed. And so this created a big problem for the U.S. citizen. They got hit with very, very large tax penalties. And at the same time, there was a law passed in Europe called MiFID II, designed to protect European investors. And this is where the prohibition came from investing in U.S. ETFs and U.S. mutual funds. Well, U.S. mutual funds have only been distributed in the United States, but U.S. ETFs would have been distributed elsewhere, except with MiFID II rules. They're not allowed to be distributed to European investors.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's we're doing the 30,000 foot. Let's drill down and get a little more granular. Your firm. So you had a very successful firm and still do. Do you still have an office in Florida?
I had an investment advisory firm, an RIA in Florida for a number of years. We ran private separate accounts. We also had some hedge funds. We had a $3 million minimum, actually. It was fairly high. And at one point, we decided to open a branch. In 2007, we decided to open a branch in Europe to serve South American clients who didn't really want to go through the United States. And then 2008 came. Then came the blow up with the French or the Swiss banks, and they said, okay, if you're involved with the U.S. we're a U.S. firm, we don't want anything to do with you. And plus, we had the crash. So we closed down in 2008 the European operation. But around 2021, I could see huge problems for Americans. Americans had no place to go for any information on how to do their investing. They didn't know how to invest in the products in the country in which they lived. The
referring to the
firms,
American expats.
That's right. The American citizens that are fiscal residents in Europe. So, and some of them might be dual citizens. It's very common, or they're married to someone from that country. But in essence, what they couldn't do, they don't know what to do. And so the opportunity when you're looking at something like 5-6 million Americans overseas that have nobody really serving them is enormous. So we talk about organic growth. I mean, we used to get, up until recently, we were getting about 4 prospects a day. Now that number's around 20 to 25.
Wow.
So it's really it's really too big for us. We can't really handle it. It's the opportunities are just, and each country has its own rules. So you have to be aware of the different rules in each country to be able to operate in them. And there's also products that Americans can buy in certain countries. For example, in France, there are like a French IRA, although there's only a few specific companies that will sell them to an American. And so it's quite complicated in figuring out. But once you understand it, it's like in American. If you ask them what a 403B plan is or 401k, Americans, they just know what this stuff is, right? Because they've been trained since the 1980s to make their own defined contribution investments.
Right.
But when that American goes to Europe, it's a new world, right? It's not that it's that complicated. It's just new. So everything is new. All the rules are new. You have to learn everything all over. And then you have to learn, okay, if I want to make an IRA contribution, can I still do it? Well, you can if you do it right. Right? So can I do the same things I'm used to doing? Can I buy Apple stock? Of course you can buy Apple stock, right? But you just have to make sure you have it in a way that conforms with the law and the regulation.
So you could buy the individual stock, but not the packaged product.
You can buy the individual stocks for sure, but it depends on the country. For example, if you live in Denmark and you buy an individual stock, you're going to get taxed on the unrealized gain at 42%. So the difference in how you think through these things, right? On the other hand, remember, if you lose money, you can offset it against your ordinary income, which you can't do, if you lose money in the U.S. So it's just a set of rules that takes a lot of time to understand, and there is no like newsletter that comes out once a week telling you of the latest changes. So what I had to do to become really knowledgeable about this area is I had to get involved in things going on in Washington. And so I became the deputy chair for the Taxation Task Force, tax policy for the Democratic Party of Americans overseas. So I had access to all the new laws and regulations. And right now there's a law before Congress which may pass. President Trump has announced that he would like to end double taxation on U.S. citizens. There was a law introduced by Congressman LaHood, which is called residential-based taxation. So it would completely change and upend everything that's going on today, which, of course, for 6, 7, 8, 9 million, the State Department estimates there are 9 million Americans overseas, they would all have to learn a new system and a new way of doing things, and there are very few people with the level of expertise to be able to offer that advice. So for us, it's a huge potential market that we just like. We're in the field where we're just trying to build the moat. Like we have the castle, and now we're building the moat to try to keep anybody out. But it's not easy to come in and to try to become an investment advisor in Europe. For example, in France, you have to pass the equivalent of the Series 7 in French.
In French, right.
And there's a tremendous number of hours of continuing education I have to take every year, all of it in French. So it's a highly regulated system. You can't do the same things you can do in the U.S. It's much more restrictive, but our job is to figure out how to get around the rules, or how to do the things we need to, not get around the rules, but stay in the rules, yet do the kinds of things we need to for our clients.
Super fascinating. So are you yourself and your firm only dealing with American expats in France?
No, we're dealing with American expats in Europe.
In Europe in general?
So we have currently clients in 9 countries, but we have demand right now for Czech Republic, Sweden, and there are other countries as well that people... I did a webinar about a week ago. There were 1,200 people that paid to listen to this webinar from all throughout Europe.
So do you have to get registered in all those different countries and pass all these different tests in Spanish and who knows what?
You don't necessarily, but it's like in the U.S. If you have so many clients in a state, you have to get registered in that state.
Right.
So if we restrict the number of clients that we have in a particular country, until we've exceeded that number, we don't have to become registered in that country. And so we're working on a new regulatory structure that will allow us to what they call passport around Europe.
Right.
It's not there yet, and there's a lot of things that we need to develop, and because they're very careful. They don't like small firms. They want big organizations. And so we have to do everything in a way that is justified, that we're competent in this area. And they look at us and they say, well, you guys are American. I mean, what the heck are you doing? We have no understanding
What are you doing
of what
here?
you're doing. You're providing documents to your clients to sign in English, right? And the regulator probably doesn't even understand the documents, right? Even if they have a certain level of English, they're not going to understand the technical documents. So, it's a process. It'll take us, another year probably before we move into what they call Société de Gestion de Portefeuille. But at this point, we're clearly able to do what we need to. And the firm is growing very, very, very quickly.
I would imagine so. So going from 4 prospects to, did you say 20 prospects a day?
A day.
Wow. So what are and we should probably wrap up on this, but I'm just finding this really fascinating. What are your growth plans? How are you going to accommodate that? Are you recruiting advisors, or what? How does that look for you?
No, our firm doesn't work with advisors, because you come in and you become a client of the firm.
Right.
So we're not interested in educating particular individuals, because there are not people that come in and understand this, right? Yeah. So we have somewhat siloed the people. So we have a team, we have an individual here from the U.S. that works on the portfolio administration, because that's a very complicated area. But you also have to know all the rules and regulations in a variety of countries and a variety of languages, right? So if we're working with, in France, for example, we have to deal with French products as well as international products, or U.S. products, or global products. So there are a lot of people, I think, who would love to come work for us, but they don't have the level of French to be able to pass the exams and the knowledge. So, and the other problem is, if you bring somebody from another country to come live in your country, you spend a lot of time and training, educating, and then you find maybe they don't like it, or they can't, they're too far away from the Yankees or something like this, and they miss it. and so it's a continual challenge. So we have to train everybody from basically zero.
Okay, we're getting the Oscar music playing here, so we're gonna have to let you go.
All right.
So
Thank
Robert
you very
Levitt,
much.
merci, thank you very much for coming.
Okay.
This
see
was
you
really
later.
fascinating.
Have a great time here.
Thanks so much.
Bye now.
And we'll be back in. Let me get back in the camera in about 15 or 20 minutes with some more content. Thanks for joining us.